Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learning. I am Britany Johnson, and I am joined by two fabulous friends of mine. We have David Blackmore, who is the Global Ardbeg and Glenmorangie Ambassador, and we have Cameron George, who is our National Ardbeg Ambassador, and we are here today for this session, Isla, Regionality and Originality, because we have recently kicked off our Scotch Whiskey Diploma, which is a partnership between the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy, Ardbeg, and Portland Cocktail Week, and we have 50 students who applied and were accepted to the program, who are doing a lot of really intense studying about all things in the world of Scotch. But in addition to all of that, we wanted to make sure that all of our friends had access to some of this extra peaty and super tasty Scotch information. So we are here today to accomplish that goal. For today's class, our dear friends David and Cam have prepared a lesson that's filled with equal parts mystery, lore, and facts regarding the home of all the heavily peated whiskeys you know and love. So buckle up. It's going to be a fun time. But first, there are 4 things we need you to do. 1, like us on Facebook at Portland Cocktail Week, where you're probably watching this. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/pdxcw. 3, follow us on Instagram so you know when there are more classes like this on their way to you. And if you have questions, if you have comments, drop them in the comment section below. We want to hear from you. We've got these talented men here to answer all kinds of PD questions, so don't waste the opportunity to get in there and ask your questions. So with that, Cam and David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Britany. Great to be here, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to lead you on a bit of a journey to the island of Islay. I know we've all been stuck at home for a considerable amount of time, and a lot of us have probably been dreaming of travel. A lot of us have probably been dreaming of getting back to Islay or visiting it for the first time. And this session is going to give you some of the feeling of what it's like to be on Islay, and a little bit about Ardbeg, of course, as well. So Cam, why don't you kick us off, and we'll get straight into jump straight into the peaty waters of Islay.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Yeah, I am also very, very excited to be here with you all today. Get to take you on a magical journey and trip from the comfort of this wonderful hotel room that I'm actually staying in New York City. So it's an incredible place. You can feel the connection between the people that live there and literally the terra firma that's underneath your feet when you're walking around. There's a vibration, there's a magnetism to this island. Today, there are currently 2 ways of getting onto the island now that we have the invention of the airplane. I would not say that taking the flight to Islay is one of my favorite things. If you know anything about me, you know that I'm drastically, just massively afraid of heights. And so flying, not necessarily my best friend, especially not on a twin prop, small, tiny little airline where you have to put your backpack essentially in the overhead compartment because there's no space on the floor underneath the seats. Your whatever bag you have, even if it's a duffel bag, is gonna have to be checked 100% of the time. And once you take off, you just feel the vibration of the airplane. You can feel it start to shake. And after about 45 minutes, you'll come down through the cloud break on a really good day with your fingers crossed. You'll be able to come down out of the clouds over the southeastern side of the island, and you'll actually pass over 3 of the most iconic distilleries in the world. Ultimately, you'll actually pass over one that you'll see has the letters ARDBEG inscribed on the side, and you'll know that you've made it to Islay. So we can dive into our first slide here as well, just to talk a little bit about the region as well.
And Cam, I would just add that you're right to be nervous about that flight, because when you fly to Islay from Glasgow, it's the only route. You're flying on an aircraft that was made by Saab. Yep, you heard it, the company that makes made cars, and it's about 34 to 37 years old. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean that when the plane's older than you, Cam, you've got to be worried.
Absolutely, very, very true. So we can jump into our, I guess it'd be actually our second slide here. There we are.
Yes.
Perfect. Wonderful. So this is just a little bit about the actual island itself. Isla is what is known as the Queen of the Hebrides, or the Hebridean Islands. It is the southernmost of the Hebridean Islands, and actually the one that sits closest to the Irish coast as well, or at least the North Irish coast. It's about 25 miles away from Northern Ireland. On a really, really good day, from Ardbeg Pier, you can actually see Ireland off in the distance. I've had quite a few magical evenings at Ardbeg. David and I had a wonderful trip some years ago where I remember sitting outside and drinking Ardbeg responsibly, drinking Ardbeg 10-year from the bottle responsibly, as you do, and just looking out over the coastline of the southern side of Isla, looking directly over at Ireland. It was magical evening. I remember it.
Yeah, and we're pretty much equidistant there. You know, it's almost the same distance when you're looking and you're catching the sight of that North Antrim coast, and are waving at our friends over at Bushmills, almost over to the right, as you would if you were sitting at Ardbeg. And off to your left, you'll see almost the same distance away the mainland of Scotland. So yeah, it's a pretty picturesque but remote spot for sure. We have had the guys at the distillery over the years in the past have actually taken a rigid inflatable speedboat on a good day in the summer and jetted over and arrived at Bushmills and demanded a few drinks. And then we've had the guys from Bushmills have reciprocated and come over to Ardbeg. So it really is quite close. And in fact, the funny story is, one of the last times that the guys from Bushmills came over on a speedboat to visit us at Ardbeg, the weather was great when they set off. They had a great time at Ardbeg, had a few drams, and went back outside to discover, you know, a howling gale had whipped up, and they were stuck on Isla. Oh shucks, terrible place to be stuck. So anyway, but back to you, Cam.
No, you know, I think that's also a very interesting point as well, is that the weather pattern on Isla and in the region can actually change at the drop of a hat. I remember a couple of years ago, we were waiting to go out on the boat and, you know, go essentially eat some oysters and hang out just off the coastline of Isla. And the gentleman who was going to be taking us out that day, you know, he was like, it's no good. And we're looking around, it's crystal clear blue skies, not a drop of rain, no wind. And about an hour later, gale force, just absolutely blustery, lots of rain coming down.
Talking about the flights again, you know, the most likely time for the flights to be cancelled is actually not so much the wind or the rain, but on a nice clear warm. Yes, I said warm in Scotland. Amazing. On a nice clear warmish summer day in Scotland, what often happens around the coast of Isla is the har will be generated, and it's a fog, just like San Francisco Bay Area. And this fog, this har, will roll in onto the sort of lower lying parts of the island of Isla. And guess where the lowest lying, flattest place is? It's the airport, of course. That's why they put it there. And that will cancel flights more than anything. And I've had several occasions taking off from Glasgow Airport, being told by the pilot, well, we're right over Isla now, but we have to circle until the clouds part, if they part. And if they don't part in 20 minutes, we're going back to Glasgow, and that's it, flight cancelled. So yeah, unusual weather on Isla for sure.
Absolutely. You know, that just leads us into speaking a little bit about the climate as well. I think it's very interesting, the fact that you point out that har, with an average temperature of about 49 degrees Fahrenheit, Isla is a little bit warmer year-round than our friends over on mainland Scotland. And this is greatly influenced actually by essentially, you could call them trade winds, or you could call it just an interesting wind pattern that starts to develop in the Gulf of Mexico, and actually makes its way essentially directly across Isla. What it does mean is that Isla is a little bit warmer. There's a little bit more rainfall as well on Isla, 191 days. The rainy season actually does begin in late August, which I find pretty interesting as well. Being born in Seattle, Washington, I am no stranger and definitely not afraid of the rain. But with a little over 50 inches of rainfall annually, that is a ton of rain there.
Yeah, and as well as the prevailing winds coming across, we have mirroring that warm water flows as well that come across from the US up from the Gulf. So when you're on the coast, if you're outside, right outside Ardbeg actually by Seaview Cottage and the old distillery manager's house, you'll see, to your surprise probably, that there's a couple of diminutive palm trees there. And around the coast towards the town of Blackmore as well, you'll see some palm trees. Well, that is largely something that you'll only see on the west coast of Scotland because it is just that bit warmer, and we avoid some of the heavy freezes that, up at Glenmorangie Distillery, our sister distillery, in the middle of winter. Gosh, it can be cold. Mm-hmm. It can be cold, just earth frozen solid for months on end. That doesn't really happen on Isla quite so much. Although, Cam, the last time you and I went to Isla together, it was the only time I've been to Ardbeg and seen it just absolutely perfect, like a Christmas card covered in snow. It was amazing, right?
That was absolutely magical. Especially when you think about, like the snowfall on Isla happens very sporadically, and especially not on the coastline like that as well. Directly where Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Lefroy are located, that is not usually accustomed to receiving a ton of snowfall, but it was very picturesque. All the tops of the casks had this wonderful little layer of snow on top of them. You could see the pagodas of the distillery also covered in snow as well. It was pristine, wonderful.
So the last point here about population, there's been quite a lot of depopulation across Scotland, I'm afraid, and there's that could be a subject for a whole seminar on itself, with the Highland clearances and various waves of people moving off the land and out of the country, largely to the US actually. But the population of Islay, as it says here, back in the early days of the distillery was about 14,000 residents. That's a substantial number, considering that we're about 3,200 living on the island right now. I believe the population decline has kind of leveled off in the last 10 or so years, largely, I guess, down to the fact that there are actually some opportunities on Isla now. The boom in the whiskey industry globally, and single malt has been no stranger to that, and Isla whiskey has been a large part of that boom, has really, from what you see in your bars and restaurants, has really trickled down to there being many more job opportunities on Isla. And in fact, if anything, there's a shortage of housing on Isla, if anything, these days. But we're still way down on the population as it was a couple hundred years ago.
Absolutely. That's absolutely fantastic point as well there. The depopulation of Isla happened in waves, especially during the Highland clearances as well, with lack of job opportunities, and then also essentially a lot of the housing being raised for and leveled to be utilized as like grazing lands as well, which I found pretty interesting. Look who's joined us again.
I'm just popping in whenever there are questions because I don't want to, I'm enjoying this and I don't want to interrupt it. But I know we're getting pretty close to moving on to talking about regionality. So we have two questions that kind of focus specifically on what we covered so far. One, I know you've talked about boating back and forth to Bushmills. Have you ever specifically taken the ferry?
So there is no ferry from Isla to Ireland. There's only a ferry from Isla to the mainland of Scotland, and it will leave from a port called Kennecraig on the mainland, and it will go to either Port Ellen or to Port Ascaig on Isla. And so I've certainly, Cam, have you taken the ferry? I've taken the ferry a few times.
I haven't taken the ferry from mainland all the way to Isla, but we did take the smaller boat from Isla over to Jura, which was that was crazy. I'd never seen a waterway that moved with such intensity. We were watching. There's a billionaire that lives on Jura, built his own golf course and everything. And I remember watching his super yacht, the biggest private boat I've ever seen in my life.
Had a helicopter on the back.
Yeah, it had 2 helipads. There was one on the
Yeah.
front. There was a helicopter was parked on the back, and then there was an open one on the front because for your weekend helicopter. And I just remember watching this boat struggle just against the current. It was insane. And then when we get on the smaller boat that launches across to Jura, it casts itself at maybe a 70, 80 degree angle so that the current can kind of guide it down into the dock. It was insane.
That sounds wild. Well, one more question about this before we talk about regionality. Have there, and maybe this is something that either y'all have noticed or you've gotten reports from your team that lives in Islay. Have there been any noticeable climate changes over the past 10 to 15 years? Good question, Darian.
Having been based mostly in the States and traveling the world, I haven't spent enough time on Islay to really personally be able to have experienced that, if I'm brutally honest. I think the guys would probably say it's windier than ever would be the number one thing, and the number of storms that are coming across the Atlantic has massively increased, which may, I emphasize that, may be something that's increasing maturation losses on Islay. People talk about the angel share being different in different parts of Scotland. I think if there's any reason for that on Islay, it could be that the warehouses we have on Islay are older, most of them. They're draftier, they're dunnage warehouses, and with that amount of wind, there's probably just I don't know. That's a theory.
No.
Don't stick with it as gospel.
That theory is from everything that I was researching and everything is pretty bang on. The fastest wind gust recorded in modern history in Islay happened in 2019. It was 115 miles per hour. So
crazy.
It does seem like that the level and rate of precipitation has been steadily increasing. And then, of course, the world is, for some strange reason, starting to get a little bit warmer as well. So average temperature on Islay is a little bit warmer.
Yeah, we've definitely had some summers that are way warmer than a normal, warmer and drier some summers, and then we've had really wet spells as well. But when it's dry, it's warmer and drier. And Ardbeggian, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but one of the things, our water source, Loch Uigeadail, we're fortunate. It's a great big deep lake, and we haven't had any issues at Ardbeggian, but some of our nearest neighbors have had issues with supply water, particularly for cooling their condensers and worm tubs.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, and I guess we'll cover that. We'll cover that on the next slide. Should
we jump into it?
I was going to say, I know there's an entire slide on that, so I don't want to give too much away yet. Well, I'm going to wait for more questions. Y'all move on to regionality, and I'll pop back in when we've got more grilling to do.
Awesome. Sounds good. So Cam, take it away. Do you want me to take it? Okay, so this first bit is something that will be part of your course, the main Edinburgh Whisky Academy diploma. And certainly when I did the diploma, I definitely answered questions on this. And it's just to recap the 5 Scotch whisky regions, which, the Highlands, we've got it there, Campbelltown, Highlands, Lowlands, Speyside, and of course, Islay. And there are various ways that different authors and different companies within the Scotch industry have kind of sliced and diced Scotland up. But in terms of, if you're doing this diploma with us, those are the 5 regions that you'll need to know and be able to kind of give examples of distilleries from each, and a little bit maybe of the history, particularly pay attention if you're doing the course on the creation of the Highland line, the line between the Lowlands and the Highlands, and why that was created and when that was created. That will be stuff that will certainly was in my exam be asked. But yeah, we're a little island called Islay that happens to be its own region. And that, I guess, indicates the importance both now and over time of Islay to the world of Scotch whisky. You know, not all distilleries on Islay create heavily peated malted whisky, but most do. And if you say Islay, people will say peat. People will say smoke almost immediately. And that was important back in the day when people weren't drinking single malts, because those heavily smoked peated malts were a very pungent, powerful component of a blend. You didn't need a lot of Islay whiskey to go into a blend to really beef it up and really give it a lot of character. It wasn't that long ago. I'm talking the 1960s. Cam, before you say it, I was not around then. I know what was about to come out of your mouth. Don't.
I was trying to keep it down, but it was forming there.
So only as recently as the 1960s, you could go to Islay and you wouldn't be able to get Islay whiskey on Islay. It was all being taken off the island. So thankfully, that has changed now with the kind of demand and resurgence of single malt. But yeah, over to you, Cam. Talk a little to us a little bit about the kind of the creation of the island, I guess, geologically.
Yeah, you know, from a geological standpoint, Islay is one of the more interesting places in the world. Its geomorphology is one of the more interesting and intricate. So the theory is that Islay is technically actually two islands that have converged on top of each other over the course of time. So if you're looking at this figure to the left there, this is a really interesting, essentially cross-section or figure of Islay that I came across in building this slide. So the way that I kind of describe Islay is that she is the island is a witch riding a broomstick with a pointed hat, a long jagged chin, and then feet that are kind of tucked up right underneath the broomstick and a hunched back, right? So I hope I'm not just crazy and seeing things, but I believe that that's a pretty accurate depiction of Islay. So the western side of the island, which would be the witch's hat and jagged chin, is actually substantially older than the rest of the island. It's actually been both carbon dated and then essentially they've also been able to date it by the volcanic ash in the rock itself as well, to anywhere from about 1.6 to 2.4 billion years old, which is absolutely insane, making it some of actually the oldest rock and earliest forming mantle on the planet as well. Mm-hmm. So when you jump over into the geomorphology of like the areas of Islay, you can really break it down essentially into 5 geological groups. The one in red is called the Rins group, and this is comprised primarily of igneous rock that was essentially cooling magma from the Earth's mantle as it started to form the crust. What's really interesting is that is absolutely the oldest rock on Islay as well. Just above that, you'll have the Colonsay group as well, which is quartz-rich marine sandstone. It's actually unique to northern Scotland. So some of the northern highlands actually have sandstone that's also comprised of a similar composition, if you'll say that. Then down directly below that dark green patch is actually the Blackmore group. Coincidentally, that is where our good friends at Blackmore Distillery are also located. It's also home to one of the raised bogs, and we'll cover that in a later course as well. But that peat bog that calls the Blackmore group home is called Ardbeggian. And then running directly across the middle of the group here, or the middle of the island, you'll actually have the Appin group. So that blue streak, those little red kind of maroon raised beds are actually veins of limestone. So that's the only limestone that you'll actually find on Islay. Is actually home to the Appin group. And then the Arigh group kind of wraps around as the witch's back down to where essentially where part of her feet would be as well in the lower half of the island. And that is actually quartz dolomite, and it's also home to another one of the peat bogs, actually the peat bog that for Ardbeg is most important, which is called Castle Hill. That's actually where Ardbeg sources the peat for malting, done by our good friends over at the Port Ellen malting facility.
And
so
Cam, that just brings me to the moment, that time when we were on Isla, probably the last time we were both on Isla, when we stood on top of that Castle Hill peat bog, and we had a special peat coring device, which we kind of screwed into the ground, and we would add sections as we went further and further down. And I think we got to somewhere between 20 and 30 feet at least of peat.
Yeah.
And we ran out of tools to go any further. We hadn't got anywhere near that bedrock. So huge deposits of peat there on Isla, which is amazing to think about. You know, this stuff is laying down in tiny amounts every year. So the time that depth of peat represents is truly just astounding. You know.
What I found really, that was such a great day. You're absolutely right. That was one of the coolest experiences that we've had on Isla for sure. I will never forget the amount of organic material that was left in phase, right? So we would drive this coring, this coring utensil down, 5 feet at a time, essentially. It was about 3 feet at a time. And you would push this coring material, this core directly through organic material, like theoretically like trees and whatnot. So when you would come back out with a cross section, you would actually have, like waterlogged and semi-decomposed oak as well, or not necessarily oak, but like samples of pushing directly down through like a tree or a branch or something like that. It was interesting. That was very, very interesting to me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Isla is an interesting place, to say the least. All of these different groups kind of converge on a fault line. And this fault line does coincide with a loch called Loch Ruinart, which means that there are some tremors and small earthquakes that happen every now and again on Isla as well, because there's a fault line that basically runs directly through the island, which gives us that informs us that Isla probably is 2 islands that have converged over time and continue to see some friction there as well.
Cool. Amazing. I think Brittany's back with some questions.
We have had a couple of questions, but I'm going to try to save those for the end of the hour, because it's a bit of circling back related to climate stuff. And also, these are from someone who is in our 50 group, so we can always go back and answer them in the chat if we run out of time, or hit them in the drop and dram session next week. But I am super excited about what's next, because we've talked a lot about the land, and number one question any distillery visit ever is, what about the water? And there's water information right around the corner, my friends.
So maybe next slide. Are we ready, Cam?
Yeah, we can go to the next slide. I feel like I put this slide as slide number 4, even though Britany is absolutely right that with a conversation of distilling inevitably comes full circle right back to the water, because the water is very important. The reason that I put this as slide number 4 is because Loch Uigeadail actually sits in the middle of a peat bog in the Argyll group, right next to Ardbeg Distillery itself. So to build a sense of place for the way that the region is constructed, ultimately, the water source for Ardbeg, it does sit in the middle of a peat bog. It's an ambatropic water source, so it's fed by rainfall. This water runs off of the quartz and the limestone of the Appin group, because the elevation is a little bit higher. Doesn't pick up any mineral content, but it runs directly down across into the Argyll group, right into Ardbeg's water source, Loch Uigeadail, as well. When I mentioned that it's peat laden, that's not where any of the flavor starts to develop. But maybe, David, you could discuss that.
This is a really important thing, a myth to bust straight away. I hear a lot less of it these days. than when I first started as an ambassador, a million years ago, when Isla was being formed from two different islands, it would seem. But what I used to hear from time to time was, oh, the water runs over the peat bogs and picks up a peatiness, and that's how the whiskey gets its smoky, peaty taste. No, just no, absolutely not. If you were to walk up a hill anywhere in Scotland, a peaty hill, and put your glass into the stream there, or to the loch, the lake, and sip the water, it's not going to taste of burnt anything, or it shouldn't at least. Otherwise, there's been some sort of chemical spill. It's going to be brackish, it's going to be laden with particulates. It will have its pH altered, and will likely have become quite acidic if it's water that has spent a lot of time in amongst peat bogs. But it will not be smoky or that peaty, smoky, burnt character at all. Where that comes from, of course, and we'll cover this in probably next week's session, and you'll be covering that now if you're on this course in what you're reading in the process material, is from the malting process, where dried peat, usually cut out of the ground and dried into kind of bricks, is burnt as a fossil fuel, and it's used to dry, was historically used as the fuel to dry the barley, and today doesn't really dry the barley, but it is used as a way to fumigate the barley with smoke. The phenols in that smoke, which are the smoke molecules, adhere to the lipids and fats in the barley, in the grain, and are also soluble in alcohol, so transfer very readily into our beer and then into our distillate during the process. But no, it's not the water that's making your whiskey smoky and peaty, not in any way. But it's not to say that the water isn't important. And I'll hand back to Cam in 2 seconds, but the one thing I'd say about Loch Uigeadail that's most important from my mind is that it is, like I said, a big loch with lots of water. It stays cold, and we have loads of it, even in one of those increasingly frequent warm, dry summers. We don't have to worry about our water source at all, unlike some of our neighbors. But Cam, take it away.
Actually, I'm going to prompt you to tell us a story, David. Regale us with a story. Myth, legend, and lore has it that on Isla, there is an alleged ex-leper colony that may or may not be visible on your walk up to Loch Uigeadail.
Yeah, I don't know if it was a leper colony. I think it was a plague colony. But yes, when you walk up to Loch Uigeadail, first of all, if you come to Isla, we'll probably take you up on a walk. But most often we don't usually suggest walking all the way to Loch Uigeadail. We take you to Loch Finlagen, which is a smaller loch. On the way down the water channel, comes to a secondary loch, and then down to the distillery. And that became very evident to me a few years ago when I traipsed all the way up to Loch Uigeadail in the midst of a very dry, hot summer. And still the peat bogs were wet enough that I was frequently well above my knees in the peat bog. Could easily have just disappeared for good. But yes, when you start that walk, you'll go for about half an hour to an hour walking up from behind the distillery. And if you take a left turn in the path, you'll ultimately come to a group of ruined buildings with the gable ends, stone gable ends still there. And the story goes, this village is called Solum. And Solum is a plague village where back in the day, some Spanish sailors were way off course, clearly, and set foot on Isla and were shown hospitality by the people of the village of Ardbeggian along the south shore there. But sadly for them, they were rewarded by the fact that some of the Spanish sailors were carrying the plague, and it spread through the population of Isla. And in those days, there was no medical treatment for that. So the only solution was anyone who was exposed to the plague was basically banished to this village up on the hill and left there to their own devices. And the people on the coast who were left would walk a parcel of food up to the halfway point up the hill, And then at a certain time of the day, anyone who was still alive in Solent would come down and get the food. And after a month or two, the story goes, sadly, that they put the food out and nobody came to get it. And that was that. The village of Solent became a ghost village at that point. So it is a pretty creepy place to walk through on your way to Uigeadail, I can tell you. But anyway, all the good, happy stories here. Back to you, Cam.
Yeah, David tells no lie when he's speaking about the walks on Isla, especially from Ardbeg, trudging directly uphill, even going to simply walking to Loch Finlagen. You'd figure an hour walk, how difficult could it be? Just a merry jaunt even. And I remember coming out of the distillery, and I have some shoes on, and David's like, well, those are what you're wearing? No, you need some wellies. You need some Wellington boots. Truly, because you will absolutely be up to your knees in the muck and mire. It's an experience.
But it makes the Ardbeg at the top taste all that much better, I have to say.
I bet.
Drinking Uigeadail at Uigeadail or at
Loch Finlagen has to be done.
Yeah, it sounds like you would need a reward at the end of that. But that very sad story about the village, I think it's a great reminder for all of us to embrace modern medicine.
Yes.
Love modern medicine. And we do have one question. Y'all may or may not know the answer to this one. Do you know where you might find the name of the ship that led to this very sad village story?
I don't, and I don't know if anyone does.
No,
that's a good question.
Jennifer, I think maybe this is the myth you work on busting, because Cam and David got their hands full. They're busting myths left and right today. So I think you maybe you take that one and you let us know if you find it out.
Yes.
But I think that's a great question to ease us in, because we're getting into some historical facts, fiction, stories, myths. I don't know, Cam, you tell me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like that one of my other favorite and kind of just joyous topics is that not only the people of Isla, but then also the myths, the legends, the lores. So we've got a couple of other really great stories to come at you as well. But if we could go to the next slide, one of my absolute favorite topics to discuss when we're speaking about Ardbeg, speaking about the region as well, is the antiquity of this ancient island. I already mentioned that the Rins complex, or the Rins group, that Isla's southwestern arm, can be carbon dated to about 1.8, to 2.4, 2.5 billion years old. There are other interesting facts about Isla, that some of its earliest settlers would have been nomadic hunters and gatherers, that we found evidence of them living in small groups, even around Finlagen, which is a region on the island we'll discuss here in a couple of slides as well. But there was an arrowhead, as well as like a bronze tool that was found that dates back to about 10,800 BC as well, which is interesting because it tells us that people have been living on Isla in communities, in commune on Isla for quite some time. And that's a thread of commonality that you see run through the island even now today. So much so that even, when we're driving around on Isla, it's not just because David's a rock star, but everybody will raise their hand off of the steering wheel to wave at you. It's kind of this very much so community driven thing. It's called the Isla wave. It's one of my absolute favorite, aspects, the community of that island as well. David, what are your thoughts on the antiquity of Isla as well?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And, I think thinking about the fact that people were, huddling together in groups and communities so long ago on Isla, you look at the island, yes, it would have been more forested probably back at that time, and therefore there would have been more wildlife to hunt, but still it would have been a pretty remote, blustery place. And that explains, one, why people were there. The more remote, the safer you were when there's, all sorts of what we might call pirates or whatever today, clans, groups, there was it was pretty much the Badlands, that whole area, and you needed to protect yourself. There was no rule of law, so to speak of. The second point is, the weather there would have definitely necessitated you to have found a kind of somewhere to be based that was sheltered and stable. So yeah, absolutely. I was just laughing, Cam. I was chuckling there because when you mentioned the Isla wave, where you're driving along and everyone does their version off the steering wheel like this, I was just thinking, you missed the trick there to say the sort of wave they usually give me, but never mind. So moving swiftly on, the Kildalton cross that you see there in that picture, that is kind of thought to be the first or one of the very first Christian crosses in all of Scotland and certainly on Islay. And now we're talking 8th century, so we've moved forward a little bit. And this ties into some of the stuff you'll be reading or would have read in the last 2 modules if you're doing the course. And that's the kind of movement of knowledge of how to distill from all parts of the world into Southern Europe, and from there into Ireland, and finally into Scotland. And if you look at the entire peninsula and the Southern Hebrides, that's where it would have come across. And I always think when I'm sitting at Ardbeg and I'm looking across at the North Irish coast, I'm looking at that stretch of water, which is probably, almost certainly, where those earliest people came across with the knowledge of distillation. And at that point, they were likely to have been, the same people who knew how to write and knew how to do kind of alchemy, which was very much linked to it all. And they would have probably been Christian monks. So this cross, the Kildalton cross, not only we've taken some of the knotwork off it to be on the Ardbeg label, but it's pretty symbolic of that, the beginning of the modern era. If you think about it, the 8th century is almost coming out of prehistory into history for Isla, I guess.
I find it really interesting how you built context for that by linking it to regionality as well. Isla would have been much more heavily forested by even 4000, BC. The island would have had a lot of trees. It would have been much more heavily forested. And then the link there to the warring of clans, even some of these clans who are closely related, as we'll get into in a little bit as well. But there were historically clashes over hunting grounds as well. And when I think about Isla, I don't necessarily think about in the modern day, I don't think about hunting, I think about farming. So, the deforestation and the building of houses and modern civilization on Isla was monumental. It was a massive turn from these hunters and gatherers that would have been populating the island quite early on. I mean, there are even stories of monks coming over. A monk named Finlagen, who the Finlagen Loch Finlagen and the high seat of power for the Lords of the Isles is named after, who crossed from Ireland over to Jura, not ever really stepping foot on Isla, I don't believe so. But you're absolutely right. The modern Isla as we know it was pushed forward by monks, by the Christian faith as well.
And it was very much a blending, though. You'll find lots of pagan artwork included in a lot of these symbols. So it was the early days. It was the society kind of saying, Christianity. Well, we'll have we'll see what bits of this we want to adopt. And I think that's the case wherever you see that happening around the world. But you mentioned Finlagen, the loch there in the middle of Islay, and it's a pretty interesting place, but particularly resonates with me because my mother's side are all related to the MacDonald clan of the Western Isles. And Finlagen is a site that is basically an island, a very small island, on a lake, which is itself on the island of Islay. So I think of almost like Russian dolls,
I was going to go with a turducken, but
a turducken. There you go. Right, perfect. Very, very appropriate time of year to talk about that. But yeah, you can walk out. You can drive to the site, and they've put like wooden duckboards out over the loch to this island site. And on the island site, there are some amazing grave slabs, intricately carved, with knights in full armor lying there, underneath these slabs for sure still. There are buildings, the remnants of buildings, one of which was, the Lord of the Isles banqueting hall, where you can imagine, they didn't quite have, they hadn't quite invented single malt at that point, and probably didn't do much, if any, distilling, but they almost certainly had beer and some sort of mead. And you can imagine some long party nights going on at Finlagen in the past. So it's a pretty interesting spot to go to. And if you do get to Islay, of course, Ardbeg Distillery should be your first and pretty much only spot. Of course, I can say that. But
I highly recommend also seeing the Kildalton Cross. Yes. As you make your way from Port Ellen, you'll pass, our good friends at Lefroy and Lagavulin. Ardbeg is almost at the end of the road. Then you can actually keep going and actually get down to the Kildalton Cross area as well. Yeah. Moving forward from the 8th century into the 9th, which actually would have brought the arrival of Scandinavian settlers and Vikings as well. On the western seaboard of the mainland, as well as the islands, including Isla and Jura. Absolutely. I feel like this is a great launching pad into our next slide there, slide number 6, because now we get to tell the story of a Scandinavian, there's debate on whether he's Nordic, Scandinavian, Danish, but we get to tell the story of a wonderful, wonderful man by the name of Prince Vrecken, or Brecken, depending on your pronunciation of it there, who I believe was of Scandinavian descent, because it would have made sense given the time period. But David, I would love to hear your interpretation of how the whirlpool or the maelstrom north of Isla and Jura came to be known as the Corryvreckan.
Yes, so I'm wearing my Corryvreckan swim team hoodie specifically for this moment. I planned it perfectly. This is not an Ardbeg item, it should be, but it's actually, if you're interested, the ferry company that runs the ferries all over Scotland, Caledonian McBrain, you can buy this off their website. And when I saw it, I thought, I've got to own this. So Corryvreckan, it's a whirlpool, a real whirlpool. They exist, and it's the 2nd or 3rd largest naturally occurring ocean whirlpool anywhere in the world. It's actually to the north end of the Isle of Jura, which sits just north of Ardbeg, of Isla and Ardbeg. But very much the two islands are kind of, twins or brother and sister sitting there in the southern Hebrides. And it's a pretty treacherous place. At the right tide states, it will be absolutely like a mill pond. And then when the tide gets going, there is a kind of undersea canyon. And in the middle of that canyon is a big spire of hard basaltic rock. And the tide, as it races through this area, gets caught on that spire of basalt, and the water is whipped around and creates this whirlpool effect. And if you've ever been there, if you've seen it on YouTube, it's a sight to behold. Pretty dangerous spot to be, I have to say. The story, and don't shoot the messenger here, please. This is just a story that has been told, handed down over the centuries by the people on Islay. Very much an oral history that's never really been written down until fairly recently, of course. And the story goes that a Viking prince, Prince Vrecken, was sailing down the west coast of Scotland, which would be, timing-wise, historically, would be correct. And he landed on the island of Islay, and he was intent on meeting up with the Lord of the Isles. So that would have been probably at Finlagen, or maybe they had another castle just off the coast by Lagavulin, actually. And he met with the Lord of the Isles, and whilst he was meeting with the Lord, he set eyes on the Lord of the Isles' daughter, the princess, and he fell instantly madly in love with her. And so he asked the Lord of the Isles for his daughter's hand in marriage, of course, as you do, and this was not the modern era, and what comes next is, you wouldn't get away with it these days. The Lord of the Isles said, not sure about this. I've only just met you, and you're a Scandinavian, you're some foreigner, my gosh. But the guy was persistent. Prince Wrekin was persistent. And in the end, the Lord of the Isles said, okay, I'm going to set you a challenge to prove how brave you are and how much you love my daughter. Gosh, really? Two guys fighting over a woman. This is, they're not very reformed characters, are they? This is already a story that's going south. So anyway, the story goes that Prince Wrekin accepted the challenge, and the challenge was to take his Viking warship and sail it up north to the whirlpool and anchor up in the whirlpool for 3 days and 3 nights. And if he survived it and hadn't gone completely mad or been killed, he could come back and he would have proved his love for the princess. So off set Prince Wrekin, and he had 3 ropes attached to 3 anchors, specially created for this task. And 1 rope was made from horsehair, 1 rope was made from hemp, and the 3rd rope, and this is the important part, was of course made from the hairs of virtuous virgins. Don't shoot the messenger, I'm just telling the story. So off he set, and the first night he laid down the 3 anchors, and just as the sun was rising, one of the ropes broke, and it was the horsehair rope, the weakest of the ropes. But he was like, it's okay, I've got 2 more. The next night, he laid down the 2 ropes with the 2 anchors. And again, in the middle of the night, the rope that was made of hemp broke. But confident that he'd get through, because he had the strongest of all the ropes still left, he set off into the 3rd night. And just as the sun was about to rise and Prince Wrekin could come ashore and be with his true love, the rope snapped. Apparently, one of the virgins wasn't so virtuous and had weakened the rope. Again, don't shoot the messenger here. So, unfortunately, the boat was sucked into the middle of the whirlpool, and Prince Wrekin and his boat were dashed on the rocks at the bottom of the sea. End of story. Prince Wrekin dies. Walt Disney wasn't from Isla. There was no happy ever after to this story. So that is the somewhat questionable story of Prince Wrekin and how Corryvreckan got its name. Back to you, Cam. I think I'm now being fired for telling that story.
I think questionable is a great way to describe that story for sure. But I'm very excited to hear more about these Lord of the Isles characters, and I feel like that's what we're on the brink of. We're going to find out more about these folks and less about weird rope man.
Just one point on that, though, before we do, that we actually do have one of the core Ardbeggs called Corryvreckan, and that is obviously in honor of the whirlpool, not so much the man and the story, but more about the whirlpool and the whiskey being really intense. Corryvreckan is partly French oak matured. It's smoke with spice on top of it, and being torn around in a whirlpool is pretty much how you feel when you're tasting it. But anyway.
I was just going to ask if y'all selected that name, because if you finish the entire bottle, you do, in fact, feel like you're spinning around in the middle of the ocean.
Well, Britany, it's funny you say that, because our other whiskey, we talked about Loch Uigeadail, but we never said what Uigeadail meant as a name. And Uigeadail means dark and mysterious place, which I always say, be careful how much Uigeadail you drink, because you'll end up in a very dark and mysterious place.
Hey, not only
the Uigeadail Cam.
Not only are David and Cam busting myths and telling stories, but they're providing life tips. Be careful how much Uigeadail you consume in one sitting, and also make sure that you are appropriately anchored to whatever piece of furniture you're closest to if you decide to embark on a very long Corryvreckan journey in one sitting. But with that, let's talk about Lord of the Isles.
Yeah.
So this is the Lords of the Isles essentially were a kingdom that rose to power in the 12th century, led by Somerled. Didn't plan to actually say that there. Yeah, absolutely led by a warrior king named Somerled, who is either of Norse or Scandinavian / Gaelic origin as well. So upon his death in like 1164, there over the years started to form 3 distinct families, one of whom David actually belongs to: the MacDonalds, the McDougals, and the McRory. Yes, that is absolutely how you pronounce that, is Rory as well, MacRory. So in about 1330, John, who was a MacDonald himself, ended up marrying his cousin, shaky, questionable tactics there again, who was McRory. And that ended up uniting two of the houses, leaving the McDougals out in the cold. So John went on to claim the title, or revoke the title, of Lords of the Isles, which had, for all intents and purposes, not necessarily disappeared, but was not unified after the passing of his great-great-great-grandfather. There may be one more great in there as well. They ended up, the McDougals would act as the Lords of the Isles until the late 1490s or the mid 1490s, when they put their money on the wrong horse and had their lands and titles stripped by John, who was the King of Scotland at the time as well. As David mentioned, their fortress would have been an area known as Finlagen. This was the high seat of power. For any of those who may have missed our eloquent description of Loch Finlagen, a turducken or a set of Russian dolls is probably the best way to describe it, as it is a fortress in a lake on an island that is obviously surrounded by the ocean as well. So there are going to be some illustrations on the next slide that we go through that will actually show you what a theoretical depiction of the region would have looked like under the rule of the McDougals.
Yeah, there's some great photos there of Finlagen and the Lord of the Isles, homestead, I guess, fort. And Cam, I don't know if people can see this bottle, not to show off too much because it's rare, but this is an Ardbeg from a long time ago that we brought out. It's a 25-year-old Ardbeg, and there you can see it was called Lord of the Isles. And the other thing, the reason I went out camera, which I know is not really the done thing, I wanted to bring that. That's my Scottish side of my family are Budges, and Budge is a sept of the MacDonald clan. So that's our family crest, and it says stricta parata neci, which means drawn and ready for death. Ridiculous.
Love it. So here is this is a great depiction. The image on the top right is actually what Finlagen looks like currently today. Actually, both of those top 2 images are current views of the Finlagen estate. The estate actually dates back much, even farther past the 12th century. The fortress at Finlagen is actually built on top of a castle, which predates that the construction of the fortress at Finlagen as well. Down below that, you'll actually see 2 theoretical kind of renderings of what this fortress would have looked like sitting in the middle of the lake itself as well. You'll see that there was essentially one bridge on, so really only one way onto the island itself. And this would have been used as a high seat of power for council meetings for the Lords of the Isles and the Council of the Lords of the Isles, as well as some, I guess you could call it a fortress and a homestead as well for a select group of people. The rest would have actually lived around the outset of the loch itself as well there. Any thoughts on Finlagen there, David?
No, that's great. It's great. I hadn't seen those renderings before. The bottom right one's really interesting to see. But it says, again, somewhere you can easily get to if you're on Isla. It's free to go to. Take some warm clothes for that one for sure, though, on that island.
Right. Another interesting and very important region area on Isla, as well as the name of one of my favorite whiskeys coming from the distillery. If we can actually go to the next slide, is the O, or the Mull of O. And if you've ever wondered how to pronounce those 4 letters, Ardbeg and O, here's a little video that will help you work through that.
It's the mist. The ferry's off. It's not going to go.
I know. He missed. The ferry is going to have to row.
I know. There's a waiting list. You can hurry if you want to go.
I know. I've lost the gist. Did he say it's going to snow? What? No. Ardbeg is making a new whiskey, you fool. It's called Ardbeg and O.
You can always count on Ardbeg. Always count on Ardbeg to have some kitschy videos.
Absolutely.
Ardbeg and O.
I love that this video is just an actual depiction of everyone when you all say you're releasing a new whiskey. It's just like, yeah.
It's so true, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, it's the Mull of O is very important to Isla as a region. It was the most densely populated up into the clearances of the 1830s. And then also historically, the O, as it is referred to, is the site of a lot of seafaring tragedies. 8 out of 40 of the shipwrecks in modern history on Isla have happened just off the coast of the O. It's quite a treacherous place to try to navigate through as well.
Are there any crazy whirlpools there?
No.
Okay, just checking.
No crazy whirlpools, but that is actually where the that wind gust of 115 miles per hour was actually registered up on the bluffs, the hills of the O, which that cliff is 430, 450 plus feet. So when you're standing up there, it's absolutely terrifying.
We went out there together on what was a pretty decent summer's day on the rest of Isla, and Cam and I pretty much crawled the last couple 100 feet on our hands and knees because it was so windy even on that day, right? And luckily the wind was blowing sort of off the sea, so if you had been blown away, you'd have been blown, back away from the cliffs. But if I wouldn't have been standing there even on that day. I wouldn't have dared go up there if the wind was blowing the other direction.
No.
Bad idea.
This is all useful information for when I make my seafaring navigational map from memory later. I'll draw the whirlpool where it goes, and then just put some little wind marks in this area. So,
right on the end of the mull there in the picture, you'll see what looks like a lighthouse. It's actually what's known as the American Monument. And Cam mentioned some of the kind of tragedy there. And you see on the bottom of the slide there were sadly several U.S. Military naval ships that ran aground. 2 of them hit each other in a storm, and a third was actually torpedoed by a German U-boat right at the end of the First World War in 1918, with substantial loss of life. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of sailors and U.S. soldiers and sailors. And in fact, the story of that's pretty tragic. That there was the people of Isla were completely overwhelmed by the situation, and at first had to, for kind of safety reasons, dig a mass grave and all the rest of it. It was pretty awful, not to get into details, but over time, all of those sailors were repatriated to the US and given proper military graves, apart from one whose family wanted him kept on Isla. So there was one US military grave on Isla from that whole thing. The monument was built with money raised by the American Red Cross and was opened by Woodrow Wilson. And in fact, the metal door. It's absolutely, you can tell because it's the windiest place. It's meters thick of rock that makes this thing, with a solid metal door that was welded shut at the opening ceremony and has never been opened since. And it has a time capsule inside it. No one's been inside that monument since, which is so the 200th anniversary, 100th anniversary of that, of course, was in 2018. And there was a significant ceremony there with US, military figures and British military figures there, and politicians, all the rest of it, dignitaries. But so again, all joking aside, if you do get to Isla and you're an American, please, it's probably the first place you should probably go. Is a good idea. An amazing place as well, just the scenery and everything else. But
make sure you wear some heavy shoes so you don't blow away.
Yeah. Well, again, sensible footwear is a must on Isla, because
there's another life tip.
Not fashionable, sensible.
There's another life tip, friends.
It's hard for me to wrap my head around there. Not fashionable.
Well, Cam, I know that we've still got a few slides left, and they are all like date and timeline focused. So I feel like we've really embraced myth and lore, and now we're going into just straight facts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bits and pieces, yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of the next three slides are really a timeline more so of not only Isla, but then also Ardbeg as well. Even though on the outside of the bottle, it will say the establishment date of 1815, again, to bring us back to that myth, legend, and lore. We know that there was legend of distillation, illegal and illicit distillation happening at Arnhem Beist, or home of the beast, which is the farm that Ardbeg is actually built upon, even back in the 1790s. Coincidentally, the first excise officer to ever be appointed on Isla took residency in office in 1797, which is right around the time when Ardbeg would have been cheekily making some of its illegal and illicit spirit. That's not a story that's unique to the distillery, as it would have been pretty commonplace at the time, because you look at essentially a lot of Isla's historic distilleries have been born out of sites that had housed distillation in a non-legal capacity. Let's just put it that way as well there. But by 1815, you would have had the rise of three of the most iconic distilleries on Isla: Laphroaig, Lagavulin, and ultimately the one and only Ardbeg, named the Kildalton trio there as well. David, do you want to input any of these as well?
No, you're doing a great job. I'm cheering from the sidelines here about Ardbeg in 1815.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as Isla's population would have kind of hit its penultimate max around the 1830s, it makes sense that there would have been a whole heck of a lot more distilleries on the island. Historically, we know that there were at least 26 operating licenses that were operating legitimately on Isla at the time, even by the 1830s. By 1854, the greater category of Scotch whiskey would have fallen on some fairly difficult times as well. And then also the clearances taking place on Isla as well as over in the Highlands as well would have meant that the whiskey industry was starting to struggle. And in search of jobs and housing, people started to leave Isla, which meant that by the 1850s, there were only 16 or so distillery licenses left actively distilling as well. In that time between the 1830s and 1850s, Ardbeg still managed to do fairly well, stocking away about 500 gallons a week, totaling in about 65,000 liters of spirit made annually. That is not the current output of the distillery, or even in 1887, the distillery was making, almost 1 million liters of spirit annually. Now today, Ardbeg makes 1.6, but is theoretically going to increase over the next few years, as we just had a beautiful new still house constructed at the distillery as well.
No, absolutely. And the difference there, and I think for those of you on the course who were at the drop-in jam yesterday, I touched on it there, that, whilst we still strongly believe and put into practice the fact that we try and keep as hands-on approach at our two distilleries as we possibly can, compared to the last time we were at the distilleries producing about 1 million or more liters back in 1887. The workforce has dropped, of course, and if you think back to then, it says there that there were families, the whole village of Ardbeg surrounding the distillery was pretty much sustained by the distillery and the workforce. Mm-hmm. But we've had real ups and downs over the years. So from the highs of 1887, as it says, the writing was on the whitewashed walls. It didn't always stay in such good times, and we've had periods of shutdown. We've had multiple ownership transfers. It's been a real roller coaster ride for Ardbeg. Cam.
Absolutely. Yeah. The 50s, through the 50s, Ardbeg would have actually been owned by two sisters, the McDougals, who are absolutely part of the clan McDougall that was given rise through Somerlet and the Lords of the Isles as well. So they're part of that story as well. Hence why David can show off a wonderful bottle like Ardbeg Lords of the Isles, because it's part of the distillery's DNA and history as well. And to David's point of Ardbeg having a village, by 1890, there were 200 people living around the farm at Ardbeg, with 60 people working the distillery, consisting of 4 malting floors as well, which and now we have 0 malting floors. We do not do floor maltings at Ardbeg. We have great contract malting facility named Port Ellen in close proximity to Ardbeg. So
we don't do floor maltings currently, Cam.
Yeah, currently. I'll leave that cliffhanger there as well. But to David's point, as the roller coaster history, the war years took a toll on Ardbeg. Even the 1930s, we had 3 employees on the payroll, down from 60 and 200 people living at the distillery itself. And then closures in the 1930s and 40s. Due to the Depression and Prohibition and World War, 3 very traumatizing individual experiences all wrapped up into a series of about a decade and a half kind of layered on top of each other there, meant that not only Ardbeg, but the Scotch whiskey industry was suffering. And as well, we kind of glossed over the rise of gin having an effect on people no longer consuming as much single malt for some insane reason.
Well, and also brutally, just you go around, Islay is no exception to this, but you go around Scotland and you stop in any small town or village, right in the center of town, you'll see a war memorial. And there will be a Second World War one there, but I bet you the First World War memorial will be considerably larger because of the number of names that they've had to fit onto that thing. So, the male working population of these towns were wiped out after the First World War. So there would have been labor shortages like crazy as well at the time, for sure.
Yeah. And then the interesting set of circumstances that gave trouble to not only Ardbeg, but then also the Scotch whiskey industry in general, meant that through the 60s, 70s, there was a lock of whiskey, a backstock, a catalog of whiskey that meant that we now no longer needed as many operating single malt distilleries. And Ardbeg was one of the distilleries that ended up closing in the 80s and 90s, opening up for periods of sporadic distillation. The distillery was set to be demolished and knocked down, but it was granted a second chance at life through the Glenmorangie Company and the acquisition of 1997. Dr. Bill rightfully saw something incredibly special about the place that is Ardbeg Distillery, even if it wasn't currently operating. He had the foresight to know that if you polish off the buildings or you polish off the stills and you reconstruct some of the dunnage warehousing, and you refab the distillery just a bit there, that there would be a rise from the ashes for the distillery as well. So today, Ardbeg is still in the middle of this Renaissance period, winning World Whiskey Distillery of the Year 4 times now, creating the Ardbeg Committee in 2000, which is a group of 130 to 150,000 impassioned Ardbeggians around the world. You can learn more about that on ardbeg.com as well if you would like to check that out. It's the best way to get the inside track on some of the limited releases soon to come as well. And we already spoke a little bit about the distilling capacity of Ardbeg Distillery as well.
Yeah, it's been a real roller coaster ride, and that 80s period of shutdown explains, why there was no spirit distilled then. So that explains some of the unusual expressions and quirky things we've done over the years, often out of necessity more than anything else, as we've brought the Ardbeg off life support, basically. It was touch and go. The distillery very nearly was demolished in 96, 97. And luckily, 3 companies bid for the Ardbeg distillery. Glenmorangie Company, as it was then, was the second highest bidder, but it was the bid that was accepted. Go figure, it's Scotland. Lots of reasons for that we won't get into now. But yeah, we have hopefully done it justice and have been nurturing this amazing distillery back to life ever since.
I mean, I'd say so, and we appreciate your service in bringing us all of this delicious whiskey. Well, I don't know about everybody else watching, but I feel like I'm filled with facts and stories. I'm going to have to go back and dig in to some of these myths and lores, try to get my mind around those. But if you are watching and you enjoyed this class, I'd like to remind you to hit that like or love button. Tell Cam and David you love them in the comments, because we all know it's true. If you want to see more Portland Cocktail Week classes like this one, and you definitely do, because we have more Ardbeg focused content coming your way, make sure that you follow Portland Cocktail Week here on Facebook, facebook.com/PDXCW, and or YouTube, whatever your preference. You can follow both if you want at youtube.com/PDXCW. And one more reminder, we do have an Instagram that is at PDXCW on Instagram. Go figure that we would use the same name for all of them. And you can always find out what we have in store from week to week, month to month there on our Instagram page. Well, Cam and David, I want to thank you so much for your time and all of your stories and your Isla-focused factoids, Ardbeg, smoky, peaty goodness you brought our way today. I did want to remind the two of you that Javier had a question in the comments about what y'all kind of see climate change, how it might impact the whiskey in the future. So if y'all want to pop in the comments after this and kind of give him your thoughts, or maybe company strategies, protocols, anything y'all have in the works, that would be awesome. And as always, please make sure you follow Ardbeg USA on Instagram. Make sure you follow Cam. Dave is going to pop his up, Ardbeg Cam, and make sure you follow David Blackmore too.
There we go.
There we go. They're going to keep you up to date on everything you need to know about Ardbeg, so you don't want to miss that. We will see you here next week for some Ardbeg production time talk. We're going to get into it. We're going to talk about how whiskey is made. And if you want to tune in tomorrow afternoon, we will be having one of our Know Us Without You classes in Spanish. So if you're a Spanish speaker, if you're not a Spanish speaker, you got some friends who are Spanish speakers that want to get on here and learn a little thing or two, tune in there too. But until then, y'all have a great afternoon.